our right to protect ourselves. If anybody tells you that the Second Amendment was written to protect hunters' rights, there's some crackpot from New York or California. The Second Amendment was written to allow you to protect yourself when the police can't or won't. And it was written to allow you to use it against the government if it is taken over by tyrants.
It may seem revolutionary for someone in this day and age to say what he said. Most of us would rather believe that humanity has evolved enough to not have to worry about such things. But I intend to prove otherwise, and that perhaps we should be more cautious about trusting the government when it comes to preserving our gun rights.
I'd give up my gun when everybody else does.
And is that
Doesn't that make sense?
Well,
doesn't that make sense? I mean, if you were to, if there were guns here, would you want to be the only person without one?
So do you carry guns
No,
routinely at home? I mean, you have a gun at home?
Yeah, it's legal in the United States. It's part of our Constitution. You know, the right to bear arms is because that's the last form of defense against tyranny. Not to hunt.
Over the last 80 years, and especially over the last few decades, there have been multiple attempts to restrict our Second Amendment rights. As of lately, the government has been doing everything they can to carry out what appears to be their agenda. We have every reason to be concerned, especially when you consider the recent NDAA legislation that was signed into law on midnight December 31st, 2011. Recently, the oligarchy that controls our government has attempted to use the United Nations to further infringe upon our Second Amendment rights. A huge outcry by the population was the only thing that stopped them. But as time has shown, they will never give up with their tactics, which means we can never give up either.
Well, new concerns today as the United Nations is now considering at this moment a global arms treaty that would curtail certain gun sales. Right now, the UN is working on a plan that would put a whole new set of international gun rules in place. Supporters, including the Obama administration, argue it will make the world more secure by tamping down on weapons commonly used by gangs and terrorists. But critics fear it would infringe on the Second Amendment right to bear arms right here in the United States.
Well, it would completely work against what the Second Amendment is intended to do, but it doesn't seem that the Constitution is much of an obstacle or a problem for this administration.
I mean, could you have American gun manufacturers being cited for noncompliance by the United Nations? I mean, is there a conflict there between the potential treaty and the Second Amendment?
You would have a situation where the United Nations is looking at American domestic gun manufacturers and sanctioning them.
I've also asked the school board to make a part of every day some kind of anti-violence, anti-gun message. Every day, every school, at every level. One thing that I think is clear with young people and with adults as well is that we just have to be repetitive about this. It's not enough to simply have a catchy ad on a Monday and then only do it every Monday. We need to do this every day of the week and just really brainwash people into thinking about guns in a vastly different way. And just really brainwash people into thinking about guns in a vastly different way.
And just really brainwash people.
It is very important to note that what Eric Holder said in that clip represents one of the most important tactics used by the oligarchs against the population. It should concern everyone that Holder is openly suggesting that we use similar gun control propaganda tactics as Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler used many years ago. By using the media to reinforce propaganda on a daily basis, the oligarchs have been successful in convincing the majority of the population that guns are a problem, when in fact, they are the only thing that can keep us safe, as you will soon see.
All right, you have to look at one of the most amazing pieces of surveillance video we've seen in a long, long time. Let's call it Granny's Got a Gun. Take a look. This is a bunch of gang members storming into a jewelry store in Garden Grove, California. They just rush in there, but seconds later, you'll see them hurrying. Shots are fired right there. That's because the woman behind the counter opened fire. And these guys, they just booked it out of there. You can see them crowding by the door right there. They're just getting out as fast as they humanly can. A bunch of them didn't even make it into the getaway car. Are they running fast? That's what happens when you give a grandmother a gun. Police say the suspects were picked up about a block away.
Oh, my goodness. That is some funny video.
The next clip was extremely disturbing, and in my opinion was a test by our government to see what they could get away with in times of a crisis.
Today in New Orleans, they got a lot tougher on the holdouts.
Police department, anyone home?
Not only the flooded areas, but New Orleans' driest and wealthiest neighborhoods, too.
Police department!
The police and National Guard going street by street, house to house.
We need to make sure, too, that whenever we knock on doors, people refuse to leave. We need to make note, call it in.
They say there are no orders to use force, just strong persuasion, sometimes entering open houses with guns drawn, and instructions to disarm anyone inside.
You say guns will be taken?
No one will be able to be armed. We will take all weapons.
That happened today in this wealthy neighborhood where homeowners had armed themselves to protect their mansions. Residents were handcuffed on the ground. In the end, police took their weapons but let them stay in their homes.
They were a little bit threatened because our weapons were bigger than their weapons.
For many of the police and guard troops, it is an uncomfortable job to do this in an American city. This guard unit occupied a church, using it as a base camp. They had to leave a note because they could not get hold of the pastor to get permission.
It is surreal. You never expect to do this in your own country.
Chris Montgomery says he'd rather be in Iraq than patrolling American neighborhoods.
Walking up and down these streets, you don't want to think about the stuff that you're gonna have to do if somebody pops around the corner.
I mean, shoot in America.
Yeah.
And Chris, go ahead. You were describing how you and your team were kicking in doors and confiscating firearms from people. Did anybody resist? Did anybody ever shoot back? What happened?
Well, we had a couple of people resist verbally, and they got stuffed and cuffed very violently. We throw them in the back of the 5-ton or the deuce and a half or whatever, and then we take them out to the Greyhound bus station, which was the police station at the time. What do you do when they stack right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they're prepped to come into the home. There's no negotiating with us. Trust me. There was no negotiating.
Yeah.
If you resisted, you died. That were the orders. You go after gun or you die.
Everybody's hurting. And when people start hurting, people start doing crazy things. Just like Gerald Celente says, when they lose everything, they lose it. And that's going to be the pretext to come in and start taking people's guns, and the Army's going to be kicking in doors, and they're training the National Guard to do it, and they're training the military police to do it, and they're training your SWAT teams, and they're giving them giant battle tanks to do it. It's all coming down.
I find it both equally interesting and disturbing that when it comes to government-sponsored genocide, that most people are only aware of the 12 million people that died in Nazi Germany. The reality is that Hitler was one of many tyrants in our past that have killed their own citizens. In fact, more than 250 million people alone in the last 100 years have died from the hands of their own tyrant governments. And right before that happens, like clockwork, the government always restricts gun rights in some way. Usually, it starts off with gun registration. Sometimes they target specific groups, but they usually always take away the gun rights of the population. Ask yourself why public schools fail to mention these other countries. I will post a link at the end of this video to a documentary that shows in detail exactly what route these dictators took in each one of these countries. I warn you, it's very graphic, but it's something that needs to be seen. It really is, so that you understand where I'm coming from.
If we can send our kids to school without worrying they might get shot, if they can't go to the movies without fear of violence lurking in the shadows.
What happens in terms of creating wars is a technique, a mind manipulation technique that I've called in my books problem, reaction, solution. And it works like this. If you want to centralize power into fewer and fewer hands, if you did that openly and said this is what we want to do, there'd be a reaction against that. People would say, hey, this is a fascist state you want to create. We're not having this. But through this technique of problem, reaction, solution, you can actually manipulate people to demand you do what you want to do anyway. So it works like this. First of all, you create the problem, but you get someone else to be blamed for it. You then report that problem through the media in the way you want it reported, because the media is owned by the same people that own the banks and etc. You get the public to react to your problem by saying something must be done, this can't go on, what are they going to do about it? And at that point, they, who have covertly created the problem and blame someone else, who've gleaned that reaction of do something, then offer the solution to the problems they have created.
And when there's an extraordinarily heartbreaking tragedy like the one we saw, there's always an outcry immediately after for action. And there's talk of new reforms, and there's talk of new legislation. And too often, those efforts are defeated by politics and by lobbying. So we've been able to take some actions on our own, recognizing that it's not always easy to get things through Congress these days.
Walking up and down these streets, you don't want to think about the stuff that you're gonna have to do if somebody pops around the corner.
I mean, shoot in America.
Yeah.
They were a little bit threatened because our weapons were bigger than their weapons. They were a little bit threatened because our weapons were bigger than their weapons.
We will. We can bring Gotham back.
What about escalation?
Escalation.
We start carrying semi-automatics, they buy automatics. We start wearing Kevlar. They buy armor-piercing rounds.
The Second Amendment says that a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of a people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now I want to focus on the part that says being necessary for the security of a free state. As long as the government has weapons that can outperform our weapons, that pretty much makes our weapons obsolete. Especially when it comes to defending against a tyrant government. Now, I'm not saying we should all have nukes. That's ridiculous. And that's something that people who are against the Second Amendment would love to spit around all day. You have your Bill O'Reillys and all that. They love to say that. But what I am saying is, we should have automatic weapons. We need bigger and better weapons to defend against their bigger and better weapons. Else, what's the point? We need weapons that can blow up tanks. Because if a tyrant government takes over, they're going to have tanks in the streets, and we need to blow them up. If that sounds radical, whatever. If the time ever comes that people are banging on your front door with automatic weapons pressed up against their shoulders, all I'm saying is, you better be one step ahead of them. The fact that I even have to sit here and state the obvious is all kind of ridiculous. What about the Second Amendment shall not be infringed do these people not understand? The occasional mass shooting spree is extremely unfortunate, and some would say that the media attention these rare events get are even more disturbing. but it is something we must tolerate when it comes to preserving our freedoms. Freedoms that protect us from a government that is willing to kill tens of millions of its own citizens if given the chance. It is a very small sacrifice that is essential when it comes to preserving the overall stability of our civilization. Just to put these events in perspective, there is a 1 in 110 chance that a person will die from a car accident in their lifetime. The odds of dying from a mass shooting in a public area in a person's lifetime is 1 in 384,000. If our government becomes like so many governments of the past that kills its own people, the odds of that government killing one of its own citizens is greater than 1 in 15. More realistically, 1 in 10. And in some cases, tyrannical governments have killed a third of their own people. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. These are extremely interesting yet complicated times that we live in. But we must do everything that is in our power to do, at the very least so we can say that we gave it our best shot. I have listed ways that you can help below in the description box. If we all follow the steps below, we can successfully preserve the liberties and freedoms of all humanity. We still have an opportunity at peacefully diffusing this threat, but that window of opportunity is growing smaller and smaller as every day goes by. And as JFK once said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable.
People, you must listen. They won't take us seriously.
They want to exterminate us.
Nobody's talking about extermination.
No one ever talks about it. They just do it. And you go on with your lives, ignoring the signs all around you. And then one day, when the air is still and the night has fallen, they come for you.
Excuse me.
It's only then you realize while you're talking about organizing and committees, the extermination has already begun. Make no mistake, my brothers. They will draw first blood.